Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to be learning about history. Last term we talked a lot about federation. Now federation was when all the colonies that were in Australia decided to join together to make one country. And that process, as we went through last term, took quite a long time. It took over 20 years to get everyone to agree on whether we should become a nation. If we become a nation, who should control the power? Where should the parliament be? What's the parliament going to look like? And one of the things we didn't talk about was when they were deciding what government they wanted to have, they needed to decide what was it going to look like? How are we going to do it? Was it going to look like England? Was it going to look like America? What was it going to look like? How was it going to be special to our country? So today I want to look at where did Australia get its influences of, and where did we do our own thing? So what did we borrow from other countries and what they were doing with their government? And what did we choose when we were making our government to do our own thing and not listen to either of these countries? So the first one we're going to look at is England. Now, as we talked about, Australia was an English colony, so we'd come from a lot of the people who were making these decisions had come over from England. So there was a lot of influence from the English. So the English system was the Westminster system. Here. And we're going to quickly go through the Westminster system first to look at how their government worked at that time. So the main thing you have to realize about England at this time was at the very, very tippy top of their thing, they're called a constitutional monarchy, which means at the top, their head of state, the highest person in the country is the king or the queen. They are the head of the state. They are the one at the top. However, in a constitutional monarchy like this, the king or queen don't really do much. Maybe back in the medieval times, the king or queen had a lot of power, but by this stage now, the king or queen did not have as much power as they used to have, because really the main person making the decisions was the Prime Minister we'll get to. So even though the king or the queen are in charge, they're the head of state, they don't really make decisions. They're not really the ones who are making laws or deciding what's going to happen. Those decisions are made by the government. Okay, so they are the head of state, but they don't really do a lot. Okay, they can sack people like the Prime Minister, but they don't really do a lot. They have to sign the laws before they become laws, but they're not really in charge of making those laws. So then we're going to get to the parties. We have parties which are nothing like a party. They're not very interesting. We have different people who are fighting for different sides. Quite often we have two main parties. In Australia we have the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. And in England, they have a few different ones like that too. And they're constantly trying to be elected. So they'll go up, it's a democratic society, so they'll go to try to be voted in. And when your party is going to be voted in, you decide who's going to be your leader of your party. Okay? And so basically what happens is if your party gets elected, if you get the most votes, the most amount of seats, then the leader of your party becomes the Prime Minister. You do not vote for a Prime Minister in this system. You don't say, I want this guy as my Prime Minister or this lady as my Prime Minister. You vote for the party, and the leader of that party becomes the Prime Minister. And they're the ones who mainly are in charge of making those decisions. Now, in England, we have two chambers of Parliament, okay? Two chambers of Parliament up here. In Australia, we have the Senate and the House of Representatives. But in England, they have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. That sounds very fancy, the House of Lords. So the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And I want to quickly go through what those two different houses do in England. And then we'll talk, because we need to know that to see where Australia borrow things from and where Australia do their own thing. The House of Commons where people get elected every 5 years. So in an election, they vote for their House of Commons, and all the people go out and they all vote, and they decide who the winner was in those seats. So like, let's say if it was the Fairfield area, whoever gets the most votes in that area, they'd become the seat of Fairfield, okay? The government is chosen by whichever party wins the most seats in the House. Whoever, they look around the seats and they say, who's got the most seats? Okay, you guys are in charge for the next 4 or 5 years. Okay, and who's your leader? Oh, they're now the Prime Minister. Now, whoever's not winning the party, they're sitting in the opposition. They sit on the other side of the House. So people sit on one side. On the opposite side, there sits the opposition. And their main job in the opposition is to question the government. Ask them questions like, what are you doing? How come you're not doing more to help these people? Why did you make this decision? And the government need to answer those questions, because they have a question time thing where the opposition asks questions and then the government have to answer those questions. Because in a democracy, you should have to answer for what you should have to answer your critics and answer those questions rather than just say you don't want to talk about it. It's good to have a democracy in which we have to discuss those problems that we're having. Where England gets a little bit tricky and a little bit different is this group over here, the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords is like, let's say if there's one chamber, there's one like little room with, well, not little, one room with all the people in those ones. There's another room called the House of Lords. And these members are not elected. Nobody elects these people. And they're appointed lords or ladies, and they're what's called hereditary peers, which means basically if you were a lord and then you died, your son or daughter can take over your seat. And it just keeps going down. So it's like they stay in power in this room even though they didn't really do anything, regardless of what happens there now. Their child or their great-grandchild somehow is in there, but they never got voted in. Now, I had to look up a little bit about what a lord was. Basically, it goes back to the medieval era where you'd have like a structure where the king's at the top, then you've got the nobles, and the noble population would be your lords, and they would own big houses out in the country. They're not like castles, but they're like big estate properties. And they would be considered lords or lairds, okay? And below that, you would have all like the knights, because they're fighting soldiers. And below that, you have the peasants, which is like the working people. So for some reason, over the past few hundreds of years, those lords still exist. Even though there's not really a role for them, they don't really do anything, but they still have a role in this house where they can't make decisions. They can't really they can't pass laws. They just discuss what the government's doing and ask questions that the government have to answer. So they can question the government's decision. They can shape the bill by saying, oh, we think you should do this. Or they can investigate problems. So if there was a problem, they could investigate that and have a committee that would investigate those problems. But they can't really change the rules and the laws in this House of Lords. Looking into this, it's a little bit strange as to how these people are in there, because there's also people from the church in there, which is interesting because quite often in democracies they try to keep the church separate from the government to make sure that they're not necessarily involved. But I guess they're not making the laws or decisions, so that's why they chose to put them in there. But it is a little bit interesting. And when Australia was coming up with their second House of Parliament, you'll see that they don't choose to go down this way, probably because we didn't have lords to start with. So this is the Westminster system. It is one where the king or queen's at the top but don't really do much in a lot of ways. The people vote for their party they want in, or the people they want in, and the house with the party with the most votes, the leader becomes the prime minister. Okay, they stay for about 3 or 4 years, and there is two houses, one that makes decisions, and another one which just seems to question things and ask and investigate problems that are happening. Now, in this sort of parliament in England, they can decide that if they don't particularly think the Prime Minister is doing a good job, if a whole bunch of them, more than a majority, think that the Prime Minister is not doing a good job, they can decide that they don't think it's confident, and they can call for another election to see if they can change the Prime Minister, which is going to be different in the American one we talk about. So this is the Westminster system. It was a system that was working quite well, okay? However, the Americans, which we're going to talk about now, didn't particularly like this system. So when the Founding Fathers were coming up with their parliamentary system, they decided to go a bit different. Let's look at the American one now. The presidential system. This system was devised by the United States, by the Founding Fathers. In about 1776, when America got their independence from England, they decided that they didn't want to follow the Westminster system. They wanted to create their own system. So they came up with the presidential system. In this system, the president is the head of state. The president is the top of the leadership. They are the ones who are in charge, make all those decisions. Now, it's a little bit different in America because in Australia, we vote for our party, and then the party decides who their leader is, and then they become Prime Minister. We don't vote for our Prime Minister in Australia. We vote for our party, okay? And then the party chooses their leader. Whereas in America, they vote for both. So they have a thing called the Congress. So the Congress is like their parliament, okay? So that's like the people who work for them, the people who have the seats. So they vote for all these people who work in Congress, which we're going to get to in a sec here. But they vote for those people. They also do a separate vote, in which they vote for their president who lives in the White House. So they vote for someone who lives in the Congress and they vote for their president. So in Australia, if you become the Prime Minister, your party won the most votes. Whereas in America, your party might not win many votes at all, but you could still be president because you vote for two different things. You either vote for your party for one vote for the Congress, or you vote for your president in a separate vote. So you vote for both. In Australia, you never vote for the Prime Minister. You only vote for your member. Okay? So they've got the Congress as one part, then they've got their president. And the president then chooses the judges, the federal judges, like the Supreme Court. Okay? Which is pretty strange that the president gets to choose who's going to be the judges. Because these judges here, if they make a rule here, a law, the courts can say, no, we don't think that law is legal. We can decide that we're going to get rid of that law. And they tried to make 3 different levels of government to try to make sure that nobody took control. They didn't want the president to be in full control, so they had a Congress. And they didn't want these two to be in full control, so they made a court system in which if the courts thought that what they were doing wasn't legal, then the courts could step in and say, nope, you can't pass that law, it's not legal. I can understand why they came up with this system, but the fact that the president can elect these people means that it's always going to be a little bit tricky because the president's always going to elect people that he thinks are going to follow his rules. It becomes a little bit tricky. But let's quickly go back into the Congress. The Congress is in the Capitol building. And that's that building you might remember at the start of the year, the building that got stormed by all those protesters and they got inside. That's this building here. And in that building there is filled up of the House and the Senate. Now the House is based on you voting in people from the House, and they're huge. That House is like 450 members. There's heaps of people in there because it's based on what the population of your area is, and they serve for about 2 years and they usually pass the laws. So you might have, like in New York, there might be like 50 or 60 people who are from your state who get to the House. Whereas in the Senate, there's only 2 people per state. So there's only 2 people from Hawaii, 2 people from California, 2 people from New York, 2 from each state. So it's a very small group, these people here. And they get voting for 6 years. And they do a lot of debating, like back and forth. And for a law to get passed, it has to be approved by the Senate and the House. The reason they made the Senate and the House is that they thought that if we just make the House, then wherever the most people are in the country, they're going to be able to make those decisions. Because if we just say, oh, there's not many people in this state, so they're not going to get looked after and they're not going to get to make decisions, we might make the Senate in which, even though they're a small state, they still get 2 people from each state to go to the Senate. So they're trying to make it fair so that just because the big states don't have all the control, that we're going to have a second place in which the laws have to get through both houses and get approved before they get passed. But the weird thing about the president also is the president gets to choose judges, vice president, military leaders, the head of education, the head of the army, they get to choose all these jobs and like who's going to be the head of them. Whereas in Australia, it wouldn't necessarily always be like that. So it's a little bit different. So this is the presidential system. It doesn't have a group of people who are lords who had that sort of that history thing there. They get voted in, so both houses get voted in, which does seem a lot fairer. There are some systems in here that didn't seem like they were as fair. So we have this system here with a president at the top, and we have the English system with a king or queen at the top. We have a few different things about electing presidents, or England where they elect a party. And Australia there, and we're at that point where they're like, what are we going to choose for our government when we want to run things? How are we going to borrow? So what they do is they borrow from both. They take a little bit of the US system, the presidential system. They take a little bit of the Westminster system, and then they also add a little bit of things that they just want to do. And that's when they come up with our system, which we're going to talk about in our next video. There are going to be some activities that follow this based on these 2 systems. And I hope that this video has been informative. Thank you.